Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2022. This is the 2022 version of the Book Trek event that started last year. It was created by Vin at Revenant Reads. He gathered together a small crew of hardy Star Trek fans, either people who've never read any Star Trek, or people who've read a lot of it, or people who've read a great deal of it. and that's what the event is designed to do. It's designed to celebrate Star Trek fiction. Now, for the first month of Book Trek 2022, we are dealing with the wrath of Book Trek. We are going back to the roots, ad fontes. We are going to the Roddenberry Star Trek, which were those were the things that we dealt with for the whole of the event last year. And that is Star Trek, the original series, Star Trek, the animated series, all of the Star Trek movies that deal with the original cast, The Next Generation, all of the Next Generation movies, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, and Star Trek Enterprise to round things out. And that is the sort of broad field that we're dealing with for Book Trek 2022 for the first month. And for Book Trek 2021, I made a rule. There aren't any rules for Book Trek. Read a Star Trek novel, and Bob's your uncle. You are all set to go. Read a Star Trek novel in August or in September, and you are set to go. You want to add a little more to that, feel free to read an old Star Trek, a Roddenberry-era Star Trek novel in August, and something that isn't the Abrams verse or the J.J. or the Alex Kurtzman verse Star Trek for September. You want to go even further than that? Read a book in each of those months and email me and tell me what you thought of it. That is fine. Any amount of participation is fine. But last year, I sort of wanted to explore. I've read a huge amount of Star Trek fiction in my life. Huge. But there's a lot more of it that I haven't read. And I wanted to explore last year, so I made a sort of a promise to myself that I would not go back to old favorites of mine. Books that I've read countless times. Literally, could not count the number of times I've read them. I made a point last year that I wouldn't do that, but this year, not so much. I still want to do a lot of exploring in August and especially in September. Ideally, I would like in September to read only new stuff that I've never read before. But for August, I want to sprinkle old favorites in with newer rereads. I don't think there's much in the Roddenberry-era Star Trek fiction that I haven't read, especially after Book Trek 2021. But I will try to find. I'm sure now that I think of it, there's probably plenty of that. But yesterday I read. I talked about a novel that I reread for the first time in years and years and years. So today I thought I would go to an old favorite, and when it comes to old favorites, they don't get much older or much more favorite than this book. You have to pardon the shape that this paperback is in. This is from 1976, America's bicentennial, and this is Star Trek: The New Voyages, edited by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth, with a foreword by Gene Roddenberry. And this is a collection of short stories, original Star Trek fiction. And every Star Trek story in here is introduced by a member of the original cast. I suspect, having read this, I don't know how many times, I suspect that almost all of those introductions by the original cast were significantly rewritten or just wholesale written by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth. They all read exactly the same. These two, when they write together in Star Trek fiction, have an extremely distinctive prose style. It is impossible to miss. No one else writes like them. So it seems unlikely to me that Majel Barrett Roddenberry or George Takei or William Shatner, for God's sake, would write their introductions in the same way. But it's charming to have all those names in here. And what happened, the origin of this thing, is that Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth put out the call for Star Trek fiction, as they write in their incredibly melodramatic but incredibly stirring forward to this book. Star Trek had been off the air. It had been in reruns, but there were years where there was nothing at all. Nothing. Where the closest that fans had to officially recognize Star Trek original fiction. I mean, James Blish wrote the adaptations of the original series, the 3 series of Star Trek, the original series, and Alan Dean Foster wrote the Star Trek log books that were sometimes enormously elaborated versions of the scripts of the animated series. But nothing new other than James Blish's novel Spock Must Die. And one other book that even Star Trek fans weren't all that aware of, Mission to Horatius, that is best forgotten. Aside from that, nothing. And in their introduction, Sandra M. Marshak and Myrna Culbreth write that had not stopped people from writing Star Trek. People had still written it endlessly. They just thought it would go nowhere. They thought there was no point in it. You just can't help yourself. They were true believers right from the beginning. In their introduction, they say, Star Trek lives. That was the name of a very famous nonfiction book that they wrote that became a huge bestseller, even though no one in the world had heard of Star Trek. Only Star Trek fans made that a bestseller, but they did. And they made every one of James Blish's books. Star Trek 1 all the way to 12, they made every one of those bestsellers. They made Alan Dean Foster's log books bestsellers because they turned out, all Star Trek fans did, they were so hungry for more of this vision of the future. And in their introduction, Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth say that Star Trek lives on the page and it will live again on the screen. In 1976, no one, not even the biggest optimist in the world, could ever have imagined that $1 billion franchise would extend from Star Trek. No one could even have imagined maybe a movie, Star Trek the Motion Picture, that brings all the cast back together. But many movies, a highly rated and critically respected TV spin-off series, then more spin-off series that are going on today in 2022, not in a million years. I was one of the most optimistic original Star Trek fans, and I didn't think it in a million years. Not in a million years. The most I thought was that maybe if Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth and a whole bunch of other people, many of whom are featured in this book, lobbied hard enough, we might get another season of the animated series. That's the most I thought. I didn't think anything else than that. The stars had gone on. Either they'd left acting or they'd gone on to other things. I never imagined. Never in a million years. So when this book came along, it was an answered prayer. I know that sounds awful melodramatic. I know that most of you who are much younger will not be able to imagine a world that isn't saturated with Star Trek, but once upon a time, it wasn't. Once upon a time, we'd had 3 seasons with these great characters and then nothing else. And these stories, these editors put out the call for stories. They got bombarded with stories. And as you might be able to predict, those were better than others. Some were better than others. You know, if you put out an open call for stories, you're going to get a lot of stuff. And a lot of it's not going to be fit for the light of day. And you would know that if you had been part of the original, I want to say, convention scene. It doesn't bear comparison with what conventions are now. It was really just overheated rooms full of stale pizza, warm beer, and original fans who just couldn't get enough of this. And those fans created dot matrix zines that had all sorts of names. Some of the zines achieved a certain amount of fame in zine circles. Some of them had pretty good circulation. They were full of Star Trek fiction. Totally unlicensed, totally unwilling, totally wrong from the viewpoint of Paramount, even though Paramount at that point didn't think it had any property to protect. And all of that fiction was terrible. I read so many of those fanzines. Oh my God. I read so many issues of T-Negative, I don't even know. I pored over every issue of Trek. I pored over every fanzine I could get my hands on. I sent so many self-addressed stamped envelopes to post office boxes in podunk towns where people were doing these things on their printer. Oh, their Xerox machine. Oh my God. I don't know where all of those things are, but it was a blast. I'm not regretting it, but as much as I loved seeing it, I knew while I was doing it that the fiction itself was terrible. Terrible. And pretty predictable in some of its preoccupations, let's just put it that way. Now we have a name for it, slash fiction. Those of you who don't know what slash fiction is, feel free to Google it. It is extremely prevalent in places like fanfiction.net or a whole bunch of other places. There are a whole bunch of story forums online where slash fiction still rules. And that was most of what you got. That and also a weird sadomasochistic urge to see Spock, and especially Kirk, be beaten, tortured, humbled, humiliated. It was weird. Some of it was downright weird. We also got fictional backstories of every character who ever drew breath or even so much as looked at the camera in those 3 seasons of Star Trek. But a lot of that, most of it, wasn't presentable for a primetime audience. And Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth in this book, with its beautiful cover, you really can't tell this book has been through its paces. This has been through its paces since the autumn of 1976. It's still a beautiful cover. Somebody somewhere owns the original painted lithograph of this cover. God only knows. They must have it hanging on a place of honor, I would hope. But they poured over all of those submissions and put together an anthology that is really enjoyable. None of these stories would pass muster today. None of them would. The glimpses in, for instance, the Spock story, Nivar, the glimpses of Vulcan language or Vulcan culture. Continuity has moved on. Fans were making a lot of it up. No one else was making it up. They were making a lot of it up as they went along. There are some suggestive stories that won't work so well. The anthology ends with a poem. So does the second one. Star Trek The New Voyages 2 also ends with a poem. The poem is by Shirley Meach, who was one of those fans, one of those original fans, and it's called Sonnet from the Vulcan, Omicron Ceti 3. Do any of you know Omicron Ceti 3? Do you know what episode that indicates? I'll read you the poem. I'll never get another chance. I thought the memory of you was gone. I thought it buried underneath the years. But now it rises, bright as Vulcan dawn, and I remember you, and Earth, and tears. Your tears were falling like the rains of Earth. You were the storms and roses of Earth's spring. You could not know that, almost from my birth, the rights of Vulcan bound me to bring. This is not exactly your poem for the day, but we'll forge on. I could not break those ties. I had no choice. Returned to space, left you and Earth behind. But still I heard the echo of your voice, found rain and wind and roses in my mind. You told me that you loved me, and you cried. I said I had no feelings, and I lied. And that, of course, is from... there's a great episode where we meet Lailani Kalani, who's... Leila Kalani is a human woman. We meet her on a planet orbiting the sun, Omicron Ceti 3. We meet her on Omicron Ceti 3. And it is revealed that she knew Mr. Spock on Earth years ago. It's in that episode. That is a great episode. I watched it recently up in Vermont on a big screen with the lavishly redone visual effects. Astonishing to look at. Just astonishing. But it was the drama of the episode that won out, not the special effects. And that the great moment at the end, of course, that episode is the episode where Kirk realizes that the spores that are hypnotizing all of his crew are rendered ineffective if the person is enraged. And in order to get Mr. Spock's help, Mr. Spock is under the influence of those spores. In order to get Mr. Spock's help to free the rest of the crew, he's going to have to run a significant risk. He's going to have to enrage his half-Vulcan first officer, who is 5 times as strong as he is, and could easily kill him. It's the first time in the show that we actually see what Mr. Spock is capable of, and that Jim Kirk does not stand a chance against him in combat. Literally does not stand a chance. It's a great moment. It's a great scene where Kirk has to taunt him. Goes for every low blow he can think of, including accusing him of disloyalty. The Vulcan never lived, but an ounce of loyalty, because Vulcans are loyal to a fault. And eventually taunts him about Leila Kalani. Says, does she know what she's getting, Spock? A carcass full of memory banks. You should be squatting on a toadstool, not making love to that girl. You've got the gall to make love to that girl. Does she know what she's getting, Spock? You belong in a circus, right next to the dog-faced boy. And that's when Spock lets loose and just knocks him all over the transporter room until it works. Until rage frees him from the influence of the spores. Leonard Nimoy does a great job. He looks at Kirk and says, you did that to me deliberately. It's one of only few episodes. In Amok Time in the original series, Kirk and Spock fight on Vulcan. Kirk is at a disadvantage because Vulcan has a higher gravity, a thinner air, and a much hotter atmosphere. But Spock is at a disadvantage too. He hasn't eaten in days. He's a shadow of his former self. And it is clear that he's going to win. But we have that, and we also have The Naked Time, another great Star Trek episode where, again, in order to get Spock's attention from an intoxicant of some kind or other, Kirk belts him across the face, and then belts him again, and goes to belt him a third time when Spock stops him and belts him and sends him flying across the room. So we do get indications in the old show that Spock is much stronger than a human being, but it's in this show that It's in the Omicron Ceti 3 episode that we see a very dramatic episode of that. And when Spock is freed, he eventually knows he's going to have to free Lailani. He's going to have to free everybody. And when he does free her from the influence of the spores, it's a wonderful scene. She tells him, you never told me your name. And Spock looks at her, and instead of saying what every Star Trek fan watching that episode the first time was thinking was, what do you mean? His name is Spock. Spock looks at her and says, you couldn't pronounce it. And Star Trek fans, the 10 of us who were watching, thought, what? We don't even know his name? Anyway, that is what that poem is all about, is Lailani and how Spock did love her after his own fashion back on Earth. But like I mentioned, this anthology has ups and downs. I reread the whole thing, and I honestly think I need to retire this paperback. I don't know that it can stand another reading. I have loved this thing so much. There are some highlights in here. Let me look at the table of contents to give you the highlights. One in particular. Ni'Var is not a highlight. Juanita Coulson wrote a book called Intersection Point, a story called Intersection Point, that really should be better than it is. Juanita Coulson is a really good writer, but it doesn't work. There's a thing called The Enchanted Pool by Marcia Erickson. That doesn't work either. Ruth Berman writes a story called Visit to a Weird Planet Revisited. And that is a weird title. It's an odd title. That's because she is looking in the direction of a piece of fan fiction that didn't get into this volume, called Visit to a Weird Planet, in which Kirk and Spock and McCoy are transported to the NBC studios, to the Desilu studios. A transporter accident transposes them with their ordinary person actor counterparts, and they have to figure out the normal 20th century world. In Visit to a Weird Planet Revisited, the reverse takes place, and we follow Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley on the Enterprise in the middle of a crisis. And it's a very short thing, but it's very entertaining. Jennifer Guttridge writes a thing called The Winged Dreamers. Again, some of these stories just don't have the punch. They might be technically okay. I reread The Enchanted Pool and The Winged Dreamers. I reread everything in this volume, and something doesn't gel. You know what I mean with a short story, where sometimes it can be technically completely accomplished and nothing gels. Whereas sometimes it can be technically non-accomplished. It can be a little bit maudlin, and it does work. Absolutely work. And that happens just once in this anthology. And that is the very last story by Shirley Mayewski, MaieWski, called Mind Sifter. The story is called Mind Sifter. And that is itself a callback to a Star Trek episode in which Kirk and Spock meet the Klingon Captain Kor, who threatens to torture them with a Klingon device called the Mind Sifter. We never see it. We never get anything described about it. They use it on Spock. But his great Vulcan stamina and Vulcan mental discipline allows him to escape unscathed. It's unpleasant, but he's not damaged by it. But it's pretty clear that a human would be very much damaged by the Mind Sifter. And again, even in Shirley Mayewski's story, we don't get any description of what the Mind Sifter is, what it does, what it looks like, but it does tear apart your mind. And in this story, Kirk is drugged and kidnapped by the Klingons, by Commander Kor, who wants knowledge of the Guardian of Forever from the Star Trek episode City on the Edge of Forever, this big ruined obelisk portal that allows you to travel back in time to anywhere and alter history in the process. The Klingons clearly want to use the Guardian of Forever to alter history, to conquer Earth. And they use the Mind Sifter on Kirk to get whatever information they need, but he breaks away from them and dives through the portal. In his deranged state, he is vaguely remembering Edith Keeler, the woman he fell in love with in City on the Edge of Forever, and thinks vaguely of going to her. That's enough of a cue for the Guardian of Forever, the device, which is semi-sentient. That's enough of a cue for it to send him into Earth's past. But he doesn't go to 1930s New York. He doesn't go to Edith Keeler. Instead, he winds up at a mental institution where he's deranged. It's not just that he's out of time. It's that he doesn't know who he is, and the Mind Sifter has implanted in him a whole bunch of traumatic responses to his own name, to the word captain, so that if those things are even vaguely said, if he even tries to remember who he is, he just loses control, flies into a fit of rage or despair. And in that mental hospital, he meets a woman. The nurse in that mental hospital is the only compassionate soul there. And she tries to care for him. And the action splits between that and the Enterprise, which quickly realizes that Jim Kirk is missing. They conduct a frantic search of the planet where he was last seen and turn up nothing. They want to conduct an extensive search of the quadrant where he's missing, but Starfleet orders them back to service. They'll continue the search, but you're a whole starship. You're the flagship of the Federation. You can't be hanging around looking for one person, even your captain. And Spock agrees. Scotty and McCoy, all the other members of the Enterprise bridge crew, they're horrified. But Spock sees the logic in it and agrees, and eventually accepts a promotion as captain of the Enterprise. He beams back on board wearing gold instead of blue. And we keep cutting back between those two parts of the story, the ongoing relationship between this nurse and this deranged James Kirk, Jimmy, and events on board the Enterprise, where Spock continues a frantic search of the quadrant, continues to search, goes and questions the Guardian of Forever, searches Klingon databases, trying to piece together what happened and a way to reverse it. And eventually he finds records of a man named James Kirk, who was incarcerated as a mental patient at a certain year in the 20th century, knows where to go, knows where to instruct the Guardian of Forever, how to slingshot his ship around the sun to time travel. He knows where and when Kirk is. That's when he breaks the news to Scotty and McCoy that they need to go on a rescue mission, and they do. They go back in time and find Kirk. And they have the process of restoring his mind. And the story is incredibly effective. It's by far the best thing in this volume. I wrote a letter to that effect to Shirley Muskie. I was saying, this was fantastic. You've made my reading month. Typed it out on a manual typewriter. Sent it off. Care of the editors of this book. And she wrote back, said, it was a thrill to do. When you write a story or a novel about other people's characters, it's not going to get printed. So it was thrilled to see it printed here. And fans loved it too. Absolutely loved it. And it works. It really does. And when you read it again, I read it again for Book Trek 2022, you realize that it couldn't possibly be done today. The segments that take place on board Spock's Enterprise take place over the span of 2 years. 2 years. When Kirk is missing and presumed dead. 2 years where Spock is conducting a clandestine search for his lost captain. When they finally restore everything back to normal and they're in Kirk's cabin having a brandy, him, Spock, and McCoy, Kirk actually says, wow, it's hard to believe it's been 2 whole years. That is explicitly against the rules in Star Trek fiction. You cannot have something like that happen. No way. No way. You can stretch out the time period of your story over a long time, sometimes centuries, like in the novel Federation. But you can't take 2 years out of an established character's life. You can't do that unless the narrative already says there's time missing. You can't just do that on your own. And that's just a small example of all of the rules that are broken in this book. And in its sequel, Star Trek The New Voyages 2, because this sold really well, and Star Trek fans loved it. As you can tell, I loved it myself. I loved it a little too much. I need to reinforce this thing, but even so, I'm not sure that this can survive another printing. This was bought off the metal spinner rack at a dry goods store in the middle of America, 50 years ago. So the paperbacks are not meant to take that kind of punishment. But this was my Book Trek reread for today. No excuse at all to reread this book when I've read it so many times. But if it crosses your path for cheap, you can find it online or something, or at your library. I don't think your library would have this, but if you have a cheesy paperback bookstore, used bookstore, they might have a copy of this, probably in this kind of shape. If you're not paying much money for it, buy it for Mind Sifter alone. I would say that would be money well spent. But anyway, since I did this, since I indulged myself, I'm going to read something a little off the beaten path for my next Book Trek video. I'm not going to go back to something that well known to me. So who knows what that will be? We'll find out together. But anyway, I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.